They found his body curled in the dark, brain altered by frequency, eyes long adapted to silence. His last words weren't a goodbye, they were a warning. Don't go past the hum. Before we go further into the horrifying truth of Elliot's vanishing, make sure you've liked the video and subscribed to our YouTube channel so you don't miss what comes next. We need 1,000 subscribers to keep making these videos. It's a small thing for you, but it means the world to us. Thank you. The sky over Saddle Ridge was a deep, endless blue the morning Elliot Reyes set out for his hike. October in the western Virginia highlands was the kind of crisp and quiet that demanded reverence. No wind, no birdsong. Just the gentle hush of leaves drying on the trees and the crunch of his boots over frost-laced pine needles. He parked his forest green Honda Element on the edge of a gravel pull-off, loaded his pack with quiet precision, and checked his radio. A small ritual, as ingrained as brushing his teeth. Battery levels? Full. GPS synced. He keyed the mic briefly, testing frequencies. Static, then clarity. Good enough. Elliot was not just a hiker. He was a documentarian of the forgotten. A habitual solo explorer with an affinity for obscure routes. He treated hiking like archaeology, digging into the edges of the Appalachian Trail system, where old paths vanished from maps, swallowed by undergrowth and time. He maintained an online blog, half trip reports, half philosophical rambles, called Phaseline. His last entry, dated October 4th, 2017, was titled simply, Off the Grid, Back Monday. It included a grainy photo of a topo map with a red line tracing his planned loop, 16 miles through a rarely traveled stretch of the highlands near Saddle Ridge, with a side venture into a drainage basin known locally as Furnace Hollow. He'd told his sister Marisol that this one was pure recon. No summits, no milestones. Just time alone and a chance to test a new lightweight antenna setup. He loved the gear side of things. DIY builds, soldered boards, and ham radio equipment that looked more at home in a Cold War bunker than a modern backpack. His call sign, KC4EYR, was scrawled on the inside of his boots, etched onto a strip of reflective tape on his tent, and coded into his emergency beacon. The last time anyone heard from Elliot was 3:42 p.m. on October 6th, when his voice, distorted and intercut with static, broke through a local VHF repeater maintained by a ham enthusiast group in nearby Giles County. KC4EYR at... Then nothing. A burst of static. Then silence. No distress code. No location ping. Just a single partial transmission. It wasn't until the morning of October 9th that the alarm went up. Elliot's employer, an outdoor retailer in Roanoke, called Marisol to say he hadn't shown for his Tuesday shift. She checked his blog, found the intended route, and drove the 2 hours to his known trailhead. His car was still there, undisturbed, dust on the windshield, thermos empty in the cup holder. By that evening, park rangers had launched an initial sweep. The weather had been perfect. Cold nights, clear days, no rainfall. The trail should have given them something. Footprints, discarded wrappers, a snapped branch. But they found nothing. Over the next 3 days, the search expanded dramatically. Ground crews, K9 units, a helicopter fitted with infrared scanning. Volunteers on ATVs combed logging roads. They even brought in 2 cadaver dogs. The dogs picked up nothing. No gear, no campsite, no signs of struggle, no tracks. It was as if Elliot Reyes had stepped off the trail and been consumed by the woods themselves. A clean deletion. Maya Halbrook, the lead ranger on the search, wrote in her incident report, "Highly unusual. No weather interference. No evidence of wildlife predation or misadventure. Subject is known to be highly competent. No indication of voluntary disappearance. No viable theory at this time. By the end of October, the official search was suspended. Unofficially, the mountain had claimed another name. A quiet update was posted to Phase Line by Marisol. Still no answers, still looking. Elliot Reyes, age 29, was added to the state's missing persons database. But in the mountains, his name became just another echo. The cave mouth wasn't on any official map. It yawned beneath a jagged shelf of limestone, nearly invisible from the ridge above, choked with overgrowth and the skeletal remains of fallen trees. Arden Blake had spotted it 2 weeks earlier during a drone flyover. Just a brief flicker of shadow in an otherwise unremarkable slope. But it had tugged at her instincts. The area around Saddle Ridge was riddled with undocumented karst formations, sinkholes that led to nowhere, and chimneys that belched cold air with no bottom in sight. This one, however, had promise. A breeze like a dying breath. Consistent air movement, potential depth. She'd roped in Micah Dolan, a wiry, good-natured geochem grad student who'd made a name for himself mapping thermal gradients in deep cave systems. Together, they loaded up with gear, hiked in over 2 days, and set up a base just outside the entrance. No trail markers, no GPS coverage. Just a slate-gray canopy overhead, and a dense silence that grew heavier the closer they got to the ground. They entered Whisper Sink at dawn, their headlamps cutting tunnels through the dark. Progress was slow, deliberate. The limestone was jagged, and the air was thick with moisture. They documented chambers, logged temperature and humidity, collected mineral samples. Standard speleological procedure. It was around 11:30 a.m., nearly 4 hours into the descent, when Arden's radio crackled to life. She paused mid-step, boot balanced on a narrow stone bridge, and pressed her hand to her earpiece. The static rose and fell, warbling like a distant storm. Then, beneath the hiss, a rhythmic pattern. Beep, 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 beep. A pause, then more noise, garbled and low, like someone whispering through crushed glass. Micah looked up from his perch, eyebrows raised. Feedback? Arden shook her head. That's code. She turned up the volume. The signal was faint, but insistent. The Morse repeated again, followed by something stranger. Voice, definitely human, but warped beyond recognition. Not speech so much as fragments of sound. EYR, at sync. She frowned. Her skin prickled beneath her layers of synthetic fabric. Did you hear that? Micah adjusted his headset, catching the tail end of the message. Wait, did it say EYR? That's not. KC4EYR, Arden whispered. That was Reyes's call sign. Micah blinked. The guy who vanished up here? 6 years ago. She was already scrolling through her notes, pulling up the cached records she'd stored out of curiosity. Her father had mentioned the Reyes case before. How the guy had disappeared practically in plain sight. How the ham radio community still brought his name up on forums. His license was revoked posthumously in 2018. That signal shouldn't exist. They both stood still, frozen in the low, breathing dark of the cave. The transmission looped again. Morse, static, garbled voice. Then silence for exactly 30 seconds, and it started again. It's coming from inside, Micah said slowly, like he couldn't believe the words. It's originating here. They triangulated the signal using their handheld rigs, tracing the strongest path deeper into the system. It was faint, like chasing the shadow of a shadow, but it grew sharper with each bend in the tunnel. The pattern never changed. Morse, fragments of voice, pause. When the signal finally cut out an hour later, just as abruptly as it had begun, It left behind a silence so complete it rang in their ears. Arden stared into the black corridor ahead. Reyes was gone, but his voice, or something pretending to be his voice, was still speaking. And someone, or something, was still listening. By the time Arden and Micah emerged from the cave, dusk had swallowed the ridge. They blinked up into the hazy pink sky, their eyes struggling to recalibrate after hours of headlamp-lit shadows. Neither spoke for several minutes as they stripped off gloves and brushed the clinging chalky dust from their sleeves. The signal hadn't returned. It had cut off cleanly, mid-cycle, like someone had flipped a switch in the dark. The silence that followed had been absolute, dense, unnatural. Even the usual subterranean sounds, drips, echoes, shifting air, had seemed to vanish near the signal source. Arden stood at the cave mouth and scribbled coordinates into her weatherproof field journal, then marked them again on her handheld GPS unit, even though the signal was too weak to give an exact fix. Old habits. The cave didn't exist on the Forest Service's geological charts, nor on the archival topographic overlays she'd printed from the state archives. The closest any map came to acknowledging the site was a smear of green labeled simply undeveloped karst. The terrain was a kind of bureaucratic blind spot, never surveyed, never settled. She snapped a photo of the entrance. In daylight, it was almost laughably inconspicuous. A droop of tangled brush, a spill of broken shale. If you didn't know it was there, you wouldn't have looked twice. But the air that breathed out of it was unmistakable. Cool, consistent, and ancient. Locals called the area Whisper Sink, a name Arden had heard before but never taken seriously. Most dismissed it as folklore, one of the dozens of vaguely ominous place names passed down in Appalachian ghost stories. Supposedly, hunters avoided it. The story went that if you stood too close and spoke aloud, the sink would take your voice. The sound would just vanish. There were tales of dogs refusing to go near it, of radios acting strangely in the area. Old-timers claimed it was cursed. Others said it was hollow all the way to hell. Now, Arden wasn't superstitious, but she knew geology, and the cave was wrong. It wasn't just the location or the fact that it didn't show up on any LiDAR survey. It was the angles. The walls were too straight, the chambers too symmetrical. Natural caves followed organic patterns, erosion, collapse, sediment flow. But down there, the stone bent at 30-degree junctions. Passages intersected like corridors, not water-worn channels. Even Micah had noticed it, and he was used to cave systems like jigsaw puzzles, chaotic and uneven. This one felt built. That night, back at their camp, they composed a field report. Arden wrote it longhand before transcribing the essentials into an encrypted email sent via satellite uplink. It went out to 2 recipients: the Park Service Field Station at Grayson Highlands, and a contact at Old Dominion University's Department of Applied Physics, Dr. Emery Liu, who specialized in geomagnetic anomalies and experimental wave propagation. They kept the wording clinical. Uncharted cave system located at coordinates X. Signal of unknown origin detected within system. Characteristics include Morse code, intermittent voice transmission, probable VLF band. But Arden attached an audio file of the transmission, cleaned as much as she could with her rudimentary editing tools. Dr. Liu's response arrived at 3:12 a.m. Looping frequency irregular. Call sign traceable. KC4EYR, listed as inactive since 2018. This warrants further investigation. Arden lay awake in her tent, listening to the faint rustle of leaves above and the even fainter ringing still clinging to her ears. She tried to convince herself it was just interference, a long-lost signal bouncing back by coincidence, caught in the earth like a voice trapped in a bottle. But deep down, she already knew. The cave wasn't just old. It was waiting. The message came through her personal line, not the official park dispatch. Maya Halbrook was sitting at her kitchen table in the early morning light, steam curling from a chipped ceramic mug as she paged through wildlife tracking reports. The call came from a number she didn't recognize, and she nearly ignored it, until she saw the subject line in the voicemail transcription. Reyes case, new signal. Her breath caught just briefly. She listened to the message twice before setting the phone down with a slow, measured hand. Then she went to the filing cabinet in the spare bedroom and pulled out the cold case folder she hadn't opened in years. It was thicker than most. Neatly ordered, tightly clipped, but heavy. Elliot Reyes had been the only disappearance in her 23-year career that yielded absolutely nothing. Not a scrap of gear, not a wayward footprint, not even disturbed brush. It had gnawed at her for years, burrowing into the space between duty and regret. She had walked his route herself more than once, well after the official search had been called off. Quietly, without telling anyone. She'd wanted to believe he had staged it somehow, faked a clean vanishing act. But Reyes didn't strike her as that kind of man. And besides, no one fakes clean. Nature doesn't let you vanish without cost. She drove out at first light, alone, without informing headquarters. The site was over 2 hours from the ranger station, a winding path into the highlands that grew less forgiving with each mile. By the time she reached the coordinates the two cavers had sent, the sun was pressing through morning haze, and the wind carried the smell of stone and wet leaves. Whisper Sink. She remembered the name from old reports, mostly folklore references tucked into local interviews and second-hand anecdotes. A ranger in the 70s had once mentioned it in his notes, claimed his radio went dead every time he passed that hollow. It was superstition mostly, the way rangers whispered about places with too many accidents. But as Maya stood at the edge of the tree line and stared into the unmarked dip in the earth, something deep in her stomach shifted. She approached the cave entrance slowly. It was smaller than she'd imagined, just a gash in the limestone, shrouded by tangled growth and a steep drop of shale. The kind of place that didn't announce itself. The kind of place that waited to be found. She turned on her handheld radio, more out of habit than hope. Static. Then, for the briefest flicker, a faint pattern beneath the noise. She recognized it instantly. Morse code. She had learned it years ago, a forgotten skill she'd kept sharp for no good reason. The rhythm was unmistakable. Beep, 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 beep. It sent a ripple down her spine. Reyes's call sign, KC4EYR. She hadn't thought of it in years, but it came back with the clarity of a forgotten name in a dream. Someone, or something, was transmitting it again. She stood there for a long time, the radio pressed to her ear, listening to the signal loop and fade, loop and fade. When it finally dropped out completely, she clicked the device off and looked back at the cave entrance. No one should be transmitting on that frequency, not with that call sign. Reyes was gone. Dead, almost certainly. But the signal didn't care about logic or closure. It had waited 6 years in the dark, whispering just loudly enough for someone to finally hear it. Maya Halbrook slid the cold case folder back into her backpack and stepped closer to the cave. Something had just reopened the door. Dr. Sanjay Dar had read the message 3 times before he believed it was real. The email came from a university contact. a former student now embedded in an environmental acoustics project connected to the National Park Service. Attached was a radio file, clipped at just under a minute, along with a brief note. Possible persistent anomalous transmission, Appalachian region. Signal ID appears to mimic inactive call, sign KC4EYR. Can you verify? Dar, now in his early 50s, and slightly stooped from years hunched over signal analysis software, had made a quiet career out of hunting the odd echoes that the Earth sometimes whispered. He wasn't interested in little green men or government conspiracies. He was interested in truth, the way sound and energy moved through rock and soil, the strange phenomenon of waveguides in limestone caves, the low, slow heartbeat of the Earth beneath our feet. To him, a good signal anomaly was like a well-structured poem, rare, elegant, and revealing of its environment. But this one was wrong. He'd run the audio clip through a basic spectrogram filter first, just to see what stood out. Immediately, he saw the telltale signs of a bounce loop pattern. Certain signal forms, when emitted in closed underground systems, abandoned mines, deep caves, could reflect, scatter, and repeat in what appeared to be persistent transmissions. What made this different was the phase degradation. Typical loops decayed cleanly over time, losing resolution with each pass. This signal didn't decay. It evolved. The call sign, KC4EYR, stood out plainly in the Morse code. It was the right rhythm, the right spacing, verified against FCC records. A real call sign from a real man who had vanished 6 years ago. But between the structured beats of Morse, Dar detected erratic bursts of low-frequency modulations. These weren't natural shifts in signal strength. They were embedded changes, like someone tweaking the transmission in real time. At first, he assumed interference. Nearby ham operators, maybe, or VLF bleed from a utility line. But after isolating the frequency bands and comparing them against recent amateur radio logs from the region, he found something stranger still. Each time the signal repeated, its internal structure changed slightly. Not in strength or direction, but in content. The message was adapting. On loop 4, the pause between the call sign and the next sequence was 0.8 seconds longer than on loop 3. On loop 5, a secondary modulation, barely perceptible, surfaced just beneath the primary waveform. It wasn't noise. It was intentional. And yet no known human-operated repeater could sustain that kind of alteration without an input source. Dar leaned back in his chair, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Somewhere beneath Saddle Ridge, a signal was bouncing through the stone, looping through a cavity or conduit. But it wasn't just echoing. It was interacting with its environment, drifting, correcting, adding layers like a ghost, learning how to speak again. He compiled his findings into a report and fired off a short, tightly written email to Ranger Holbrook and the National Park Service contact listed in the original message. Preliminary analysis suggests localized signal bounce loop with anomalous modulation evolution. Recommend immediate on-site spectral mapping. Signal is not static. It is changing. As the spectrogram continued to scroll across his monitor, waveforms morphing in slow, deliberate pulses, Dr. Sanjay Dar felt an unfamiliar chill settle into his bones. This wasn't just a signal repeating itself. It was listening. The morning they went into Whisper Sink, the fog hung low over Saddle Ridge like a lid. Mist curled through the tree trunks, swallowing sound and softening every edge. Ranger Maya Halbrook stood at the edge of the sinkhole's tree line, staring down into the gnarled mouth of the cave, her pack already digging into her shoulders. To her right, Arden Blake adjusted a shoulder strap with slow, practiced movements, eyes scanning the canopy. Micah Dolan crouched near the cave entrance, double-checking the case containing the spectral analyzer. No one spoke much. The gear had all been tested. The plan was clear. And yet, a weight hung between them. Something old, heavy, and without a name. They weren't alone this time. The Park Service had sent Dan Price, a cave rescue specialist who'd worked everything from sinkhole entrapments in Missouri to a flash flood incident in Arizona. He moved like a man accustomed to darkness, lean and alert, with rope scars on his knuckles and the wary calm of someone who'd seen things caves didn't want found. Alongside him was Dr. Leah Fern, a geophysicist from Virginia Tech, who had brought enough custom-built sensors to map the cave's electromagnetic behavior in 3 dimensions. She was precise, quiet, and deeply skeptical, traits Maya appreciated. The descent began at 0900. Whisper Sink swallowed them whole in a matter of minutes. Sunlight vanished within the first 30 feet, giving way to a narrow, damp throat that led into the deeper limestone belly. The temperature dropped rapidly, the air still and mineral-rich. Price led the way, laying guide rope as they moved. Behind him, Arden and Micah operated the directional antenna array, pausing every few meters to sweep for signal deviation. Leah moved deliberately, planting EM sensors at designated intervals and logging compass variants as they went. The first anomaly appeared barely 40 meters in, a low, slow distortion in Micah's voice as he called out readings to Arden. His words stretched oddly, syllables echoing longer than they should have, as if bouncing off walls that weren't there. Maya glanced over, instinctively checking her own radio. Static hummed faintly, like wind through a wire. "Did anyone else hear that?" she asked. "I didn't say anything weird," Micah replied, frowning. "Why?" "Your voice," Arden said, looking up. "It dragged." They moved on, but it kept happening. Spoken words didn't echo in the expected way. Sometimes they didn't echo at all. At other times, a single syllable would repeat itself, bouncing down the tunnel after they'd gone quiet. Dr. Fern took a compass reading near a sharp bend in the corridor and cursed under her breath. The needle swung wildly, dancing without direction. "That's not magnetic interference," she muttered. "It's field inversion, the rocks reading like a polarized shell." They passed through a narrow chute that widened into a chamber shaped like a half-collapsed dome. On the floor, fragments of broken stone formed strange, right-angled patterns. Arden stopped in her tracks. "This isn't natural erosion," she whispered. "This is geometry." The team set up temporary camp at the chamber's edge, rerouting the antenna array to triangulate the original signal. It was faint, fluctuating like breath, but still present, threading through the rock in a looping rhythm that seemed to shift slightly each time it played. Morse, static, voice, pause. Maya crouched by the receiver and listened, her face lit by the soft red glow of the readout. It wasn't just the signal that had led them here. It was something deeper, a sense that the cave itself was not merely a structure, but a system. And they had just begun to enter its logic. The chamber was deep, far deeper than any of them had expected to go on the first day. It had taken 6 hours of crawling, rappelling, and squeezing through limestone throats slick with condensation before they reached the lowest vault. A hollowed-out basin flanked on all sides by striated walls that looked almost carved. The air down here was different. Warmer, damp with an undercurrent of something metallic, something that clung to the tongue and sat heavy in the lungs. The signal grew stronger the closer they moved. It pulsed steadily through the handheld receiver. It cycled tight and unwavering now. Morse. A fragment of voice. Silence. Repeat. The pitch modulation no longer shifted. It was consistent, deliberate. Triangulation led them to the far corner of the chamber, behind a jagged outcrop of stone near a natural vent, releasing a steady exhale of geothermal warmth. And there it was. The antenna array looked like something grown instead of built. Fragile, skeletal arms of copper wire, some still clad in chewed insulation, stretched between natural stone pillars. It had been anchored into the rock with scavenged bolts, lengths of steel rebar, and what looked like the skeleton of a camp chair. Strips of weatherproof nylon, likely from a backpack, held components together in a kind of chaotic but functional web. Attached at the center, nestled within a foam-lined ammunition box, was a radio, or what had once been a radio. Maya stepped closer and crouched, her gloved hand brushing a call sign scratched faintly into the plastic casing. Cakes 4 EYR. Micah sucked in a breath. That's his. That's Reyes's rig. The transceiver had been heavily modified. Its panel was exposed, innards soldered and spliced with unfamiliar precision. Tubing extended from the box to a battery array, half buried under loose stone. Dr. Fern bent over the system, tracing the wiring with quiet disbelief. "This battery shouldn't be running," she said. "It shouldn't be here at all. The cells are degraded, but not dead. And these," she pointed to 2 narrow metal rods pressed into the thermal vent, "are thermoelectric generators, crude, but effective." "You're saying the heat is keeping this alive?" Arden asked. Fern nodded slowly. "Heat differential, yes. It's drawing just enough power to keep the signal transmitting. Minimal draw, but enough." Price knelt beside the antenna and shook his head. "Even if he built this before he died." "He didn't," Fern cut in. "Not all of it. Some of these materials are less than a year old." She pointed to a polymer casing on a capacitor. "This part wasn't even on the market 6 years ago. Someone's been maintaining this, recently." Silence spread through the chamber. The implications settled like dust. "Reyes didn't just crawl down here, die, and leave a legacy broadcast," Maya said, her voice low. "This thing has been kept alive, tended to." Micah slowly panned his headlamp along the walls, half expecting to see something watching. "By who?" No one answered. The radio crackled faintly, a whisper between pulses. The same message, over and over. A signal doesn't maintain itself. It doesn't upgrade its components. It doesn't build crude geothermal power arrays from camping scraps and thermoelectric plates. Someone, or something, was still down here, and it was keeping the message alive. It was Arden who spotted the break in the rockfall, a subtle distortion along the far wall of the chamber, where the collapsed ceiling hadn't quite sealed flush to the floor. A narrow fissure yawned behind it, barely 2 feet high, but stretching inward at a low, sloping angle. The air wafting from it smelled different. Staler, older, tinged with something organic and faintly acidic, like mold growing on metal. Price went in first, shimmying through on his elbows, headlamp cutting a pale swath through the dark. A minute later, his voice came back, muffled but urgent. "There's something back here. A cache or a shelter. Can't tell yet." One by one, the others followed, until they emerged into a crawl space, barely the size of a small van. It was drier than the surrounding chamber and noticeably warmer, insulated by the thick stone above and sealed from moisture by the rock fall. At the far end of the pocket, tucked into a nest of shredded nylon and foam, was a gray dry bag coated in a fine layer of dust. Maya stepped forward cautiously, knelt beside it, and unzipped the seal. Inside were three things: a waterproof field journal, warped slightly at the edges, but intact; a laminated ID card, Elliot Reyes, Appalachian Trail Conservancy Volunteer, KC4EYR, and a digital voice recorder. Arden took the journal carefully and opened it. The pages crackled, but held firm. Reyes had written in tight, deliberate print, often in bullet points, like he'd been trying to keep his thoughts ordered. The first entries were what you'd expect: trail notes, observations about geology, terrain, weather. Then, about a third of the way through, the tone changed. October 7th. Heard a sound in the lower tunnel. Thought it was water. Not water. October 8th. Woke up with a headache, deep, bass in the bones. There's a hum, faint, but always there. October 9th. Something's wrong with the rock. Voices when I touch the walls. Not imagination. Different tones. Layered, like a chorus out of sync. October 10th. Don't think I'm alone. No animals. No movement. But the air feels watched, traced. The last page was more erratic, as though written in poor light or with a shaking hand. I can't tell how long I've been here. Time slips. The hum changes. I can't sleep. They're not echoes. Arden stopped reading. Micah, meanwhile, had powered on the recorder. It blinked twice, then played. The first few files were nothing but ambient cave noise. Breathing. Movement. At one point, Reyes muttering to himself, barely audible. Then came the final entry. It started with silence, broken only by wet breathing and a soft clatter, like the recorder being handled with clumsy fingers. Then a whisper. They're not echoes. Another pause. They're watching. The file ended with a sharp exhale. Not a scream, not a cry. Just breath, cut short. No one spoke for a long time. The gear was carefully packed, sealed in evidence bags. But even after they left the pocket and crawled back into the main chamber, the silence followed them. The walls felt tighter, the dark more aware. They had found Reyes's cache, his voice, his fear, and something had heard him. The lab was quiet but never truly silent. Behind the soundproofing panels and racks of equipment, there was always a low mechanical hum. Cooling fans, circuit resonance, electricity moving in its endless, invisible dance. Dr. Sanjay Dar sat at his console, headphones clamped tight to his ears, his gaze fixed on the spectral waterfall cascading across his monitor. A river of frequency, light and color encoded in motion. The signal from Whisper Sync was still playing, piped in through a series of filters and modulators, looped and slowed until its secrets began to rise to the surface like oil on water. It wasn't just Morse code. That much was clear now. The call sign, KC4EYR, was consistent, a kind of identity anchor built into the transmission. But layered beneath it, beneath the static bursts and garbled voice fragments, was something else entirely. A pulse, low, rhythmic, steady. Too low for the human ear to detect unaided. But there, unmistakably, in the spectrum below, 20 hertz. A subharmonic, subsonic, almost infrasound. Dr. Dar leaned forward, fingers tapping out a quick batch command to isolate and enhance the frequency. The waveform resolved itself, slow, almost heartbeat-like. He ran the numbers, 8.7 hertz, fluctuating gently around a narrow band, not random, not noise, brainwave territory. He pulled up a comparative chart. Delta waves, 0.5 to 4 hertz. Theta, 4 to 8. Alpha, 8 to 12. This one pulsed directly on the boundary, skirting alpha and theta, a zone typically associated with drowsiness, meditation, hypnagogic states, states of altered awareness. He ran a second comparison, overlaying the subharmonic onto a sample EEG readout from a recent sleep study. The match wasn't perfect, but it was close enough to spike his pulse. The signal was mimicking brainwave activity, or influencing it. He sat back, the implications unfurling like smoke. Reyes had been hearing voices, not in a metaphorical sense, not in madness. The journal entries described the hum, a pressure in the skull as if the very stone had begun to vibrate with intent. And now, here was a frequency buried in his final transmission, inaudible to the naked ear, but resonating in the body. Could the cave itself, its shape, its geology, its materials, have formed a natural amplifier for these waves? Or worse, could someone have constructed this signal deliberately, knowing what it could do? He reviewed the logs again, this time tracking frequency modulation over time. The signal evolved gently, slowly. Each loop was not identical. It varied ever so slightly in pitch and waveform, like a key trying to find the exact right lock. It wasn't broadcasting. It was probing. He picked up the phone and called Ranger Maya Halbrook directly. She answered on the second ring. "You're not going to like this," he said, wasting no time. "The transmission is writing a subharmonic that matches transitional brainwave states. It's the kind of frequency that can induce disorientation, fatigue, hallucinations. If Reyes was exposed to it for long periods, it could explain everything: his confusion, his paranoia, the voices." There was a pause. Then Maya's voice, steady but distant. "Are you saying the signal could be affecting people?" "I'm saying it already did," he replied. "And if it's still broadcasting, it still could." He muted the line and stared at the screen again. The waveform pulsed, hypnotic and slow. It didn't feel like data anymore. It felt like something watching, something waiting to be heard. The second descent began before dawn, while the world above still slept in fog and silence. Arden hadn't waited for clearance. She hadn't even waited for full consensus. There was something in Reyes's notes that wouldn't let her go. A page near the end, hand-sketched with trembling lines, detailing a passage he called "Beneath the Hum." No coordinates, no elevation data, just a rough drawing, a split in the stone, a downward path, and one word scrawled beside it in uneven block letters: "Don't." It wasn't a warning. It was a confession. Micah came willingly, shouldering the gear without question. Price and Maya followed more reluctantly, and Dr. Fern only after extracting a promise that she could pull them out the moment readings turned dangerous. They moved quickly through the known route, reaching the antenna chamber by early afternoon. The signal was still broadcasting, looping, clean, patient. At the far wall, beyond the thermal vent, Arden found what she'd been looking for. A vertical crack in the stone, narrow and dark, marked with a faint smear of ash along one edge. Reyes had passed this way. She was sure of it. The passage tightened almost immediately, forcing the team into a single-file crawl, their breath echoing wetly in the confined space. The rock here was different, denser, veined with unfamiliar minerals that shimmered under the lights. The air was heavier too, saturated with the same low humming pressure Reyes had described. It was no longer theoretical. You could feel it in your bones, a frequency without sound, pulsing like a second heartbeat. 100 feet in, their radios began to fail. First came the distortion, sharp bursts of static between words. Then the latency, voices delayed by seconds, as though bouncing off walls in other worlds. Finally, the dropouts. One by one, the units fell silent. Dr. Fern attempted to reroute signal through a short-range booster, but the interference was overwhelming. The rock was swallowing everything. They pressed on, relying on rope and touch, their headlamps the only clarity in the dark. but even light seemed to behave strangely here. It faded too quickly, the beam dissipating into a hazy gloom that clung to the stone like smoke. Shadows stretched in the wrong direction. Occasionally, someone's light would flicker, not from power loss, but like something was passing between them and the source. It was Micah who first saw the marks. They were on the wall of a wide, dry chamber, a space so still it felt vacuum-sealed. Tally marks, hundreds of them, maybe more, etched into the stone in uneven rows, overlapping and chaotic. Some were deep, gouged with metal. Others were shallow, jagged, broken, clearly made by human fingernails. Price moved closer, shining his light along the scratches. "These weren't all made at once," he muttered. "Look at the wear patterns. Some are years old, some are recent." Arden's voice was quiet. He was counting days. Or something was. Near the far corner of the chamber, beneath a shelf of hanging stone, they found a patch of smoothed rock where skin and sweat had rubbed the mineral sheen away. Beside it, embedded in the soft dust of the floor, was a fingernail. Torn. Human. No one spoke after that. Not even Micah. Whatever Reyes had found beneath the hum, it hadn't let him go gently. And they had just stepped into its memory. The fissure was almost invisible from the main chamber. Just a hairline fracture in the stone behind a curtain of flowstone that looked like melted wax. Arden noticed it only when she leaned against the wall to steady herself and felt the subtle draft. The air that bled through was warmer than the rest of the cave, almost imperceptibly so. But it smelled different. Less mineral, more organic. Decay, but old and dry. She called Micah over, and together they cleared a narrow passage through the brittle calcite. Behind it was a crawl space, just wide enough to pass through on hands and knees, sloping down in a tight corkscrew that led to a hollowed-out room barely tall enough to stand in. The air inside was still, the temperature strangely stable, as if the space had sealed itself off from the passage of time. The beam of Arden's headlamp swept across the walls, stone scoured smooth by contact, places where bare skin had worn down mineral. In the center of the room, half surrounded by a low horseshoe of rock, was the unmistakable sign of long-term shelter. Piles of crumpled fabric layered like nests, a half-burned lantern, the melted base of a plastic water bottle. Bones, small, pale, and brittle, were stacked neatly in a corner. Animal bones. Squirrel, bird, something with long, thin limbs. Micah stepped closer, crouched, and picked up one of the skulls. "These weren't just dragged in here," he said quietly. "They were cleaned." Arden didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the far corner of the shelter, where a half-buried sleeping bag slumped against the wall, mostly concealed by debris and cave dust. The fabric was sun-bleached and cracked, but the shape it held was unmistakable. Human. Price approached first, brushing the dirt away with gloved hands. The figure inside was curled on its side, knees drawn up, arms tight against the chest. The skin was leathery and taut, pulled tight over sharp angles. Hair still clung to the scalp in brittle wisps. The left hand was pressed to the chest, and in it, held so tightly the fingers had locked around it, was a handheld radio. The antenna was snapped clean off. The body cracked, as if it had been gripped too hard for too long. No one spoke for several minutes. Even Maya stood silent, helmet off, one hand resting on the stone wall as if she needed it to remain upright. Micah knelt beside the remains and gently unwrapped the fist. The radio came free with a faint snap of brittle tendons. Arden stared down at the faint engraving on the side panel, Reyes's initials, etched in shaky lines with the tip of a knife. They had found him. Dental records would later confirm it. It was Elliot Reyes, age 29, missing for 6 years. But the forensics couldn't pin down when he had died. There were no obvious injuries, no trauma. The state of preservation suggested dehydration, starvation, possibly exposure. But the surrounding evidence was stranger. The makeshift shelter showed signs of ongoing maintenance. The bones were clean, the debris sorted, the gear positioned with care. Not the chaos of a man slowly losing his mind, but the habits of someone surviving. And that was the detail none of them wanted to say aloud. He may have lived here for months, maybe years. Alone, clutching a broken radio in the dark, beneath the hum. The examination took place in a controlled lab in Roanoke, a facility used for both academic research and high-profile forensic cases when the Park Service needed answers that their internal resources couldn't provide. The body of Elliot Reyes arrived in a sealed containment chamber, still partially encased in the sleeping bag where he had been found. The exterior had been swabbed for environmental trace material. The interior, where he had curled into himself, where the radio had fused into his final gesture, was left untouched until the team was ready. Dr. Alyssa Candell was a forensic pathologist with 2 decades of experience in trauma analysis, cadaver decomposition, and post-mortem neuroanatomy. She had seen bodies buried in peat bogs, frozen in glaciers, mummified in desert caves. Preservation always had a logic. Moisture, temperature, microbial activity, nothing stayed intact without reason. But this was not natural. The first sign was the condition of the skin. Reyes's dermal tissue, despite being found in a cave system with fluctuating humidity, showed no signs of mold, bacterial bloom, or the expected sloughing that came with long-term exposure. The skin was leathery but intact, as if it had undergone a kind of spontaneous desiccation. Not dried out, not chemically preserved. Just paused. Internal tissue samples revealed something more troubling. Muscle groups, particularly around the eyes and jaw, were hypertrophied in strange patterns. Tight, overdeveloped, as though Reyes had spent prolonged periods in a heightened state of tension. The optic nerves were degraded in a way Candle had only seen in deep-sea autopsies, where light deprivation caused the eyes to atrophy. But the retinal cones had adapted. It was as if his body had tried to evolve, slowly, desperately, to see in absolute darkness. It got stranger. When they removed the skull cap to examine the brain, the first reaction was disbelief. The cranial cavity showed no trauma, but the brain itself was anomalous, grossly enlarged in the parietal lobes, especially in the areas associated with spatial awareness and auditory processing. The hippocampus was swollen, laced with strange fibrous tissue unlike anything Dr. Candle had encountered. Some sections had the texture of scar, but with no trauma to account for it. It wasn't just damage, it was growth. Purposeful, ordered growth. Microscopic imaging revealed structures woven into the neural tissue, microtubules branching off in unnatural patterns, almost like cilia reacting to external stimulus. The closest analogs came from studies on patients with prolonged sensory isolation. But this was beyond adaptation. It was transformation. He wasn't just surviving, Condell told Maya Holbrook when the ranger came to the lab for a debrief. He was changing. His body was reshaping itself around his environment, or his environment was reshaping him. Maya stared at the data printouts, at the CT scans of Reyes's skull with the highlighted anomalies. You're saying the cave changed him? I'm saying whatever was down there, the frequency, the isolation, something. interacted with his biology in a way we can't explain. This man wasn't decomposing the way he should have because he wasn't living the way he should have. She paused, glancing at the container where the broken radio now sat, tagged and logged as evidence. And we don't know what parts of him still might be listening. The cave hadn't just taken Elliot Reyes. It had started to make him into something else. Micah Dolan sat cross-legged on the floor of the university archive, surrounded by a halo of dust-coated map tubes, parchment folders, and yellowing paper that curled at the corners like old leaves. He had been searching for nearly 6 hours, combing through cartographic records, colonial field notes, and Civil War-era mining logs. Anything that might provide context for Whisper Sink. The cave that had rewritten every assumption they'd made about the disappearance of Elliot Reyes. The earliest government-sanctioned topographical maps, dated from the 1920s and commissioned as part of the Appalachian Trail Corridor project, showed nothing. No cave, no depression, not even a significant fault line. The area was labeled as low-density hardwood forest, moderate elevation, with a benign contour profile that gave no hint of the yawning sinkhole that now felt, to Micah, like the throat of something ancient and unfinished. It wasn't until he began exploring the deeper archival drawer, handwritten indices, long since digitized but never fully interpreted, that he found the first real thread, a leather-bound field journal, dated 1861, authored by a Confederate mining supervisor named Elias Corbin. It was a day-by-day account of an exploratory dig for iron ore near what he described as the far ridges west of Devil's Backbone. One entry stood out immediately, its lines cramped and slanted. March 17th, 2 men missing. Reuben and Clay. No sign of departure, no tracks. Last seen by the fire after supper. By morning, their places were cold. Men nervous. Say the air down shaft is too quiet, that they can hear something breathing in the stone when they stop talking. Micah turned the page. March 19th. Halted dig. One man struck another with a pick over nothing. Said he saw something in the wall, reflections that moved when he didn't. The sound is worse, like a voice you can't quite understand, humming just outside your skull. Have written to command. We are leaving. Another map followed. A sketch drawn in graphite, rough but labeled with the practiced hand of someone trained in field measurements. The outline of a ridgeline, marked with a simple, jagged shape near its base. A note below. Avoid this basin. It is not made for men. Micah scanned the symbol into his tablet and overlaid it on modern satellite imagery. The shape matched Whisper Sink almost perfectly. He exhaled through his nose, the weight of old dread settling in his gut. A second breakthrough came from a different source altogether. An ethnographic study of regional Cherokee settlements published in the 1930s. Among its notations was a reference to a sacred place, no longer visited, called Duliska Ganehi, translated loosely as the mouth of silence. The location was only described as a place where sound is eaten and time forgets. The study noted that local elders had forbidden children from approaching it. Hunters avoided the ridgeline entirely. No game passed through it, even during migration. It was a place of stillness, not peace, absence. Maya, when shown the records, said little at first, but her fingers tightened around the old map Micah had laid across the table. The same place, referenced in folklore and field reports, marked and then unmarked for over a century. People didn't forget about this place, she said finally. They erased it. Whisper Sink had never been a mystery of omission. It had been an act of willful silence. Decades, maybe centuries, of choosing not to see, choosing not to name. And now, something inside it had begun to speak again. Dr. Sanjay Dar hadn't slept in nearly 30 hours. His office was a dim constellation of glowing monitors and half-drained coffee cups, every horizontal surface buried under printouts, seismic logs, and waveforms. Somewhere behind the closed blinds, the world outside was shifting from night into a sluggish Virginia morning. But down here, among the hum of processors and the pulse of data streams, it might as well have been the cave itself. He pulled up the spectrogram for the 5th time, staring at the repeating signal pulled from Whisper Sync. At first glance, it was nearly identical to previous loops. Reyes's call sign in Morse, a stuttering fragment of garbled voice, then silence. But when he began layering the signal against seismic telemetry from a nearby geologic sensor array, data recorded over the past 6 months, he saw it. Not noise, not interference, a pattern, a deep pulse, not audible, not electrical, seismic. It registered as micro-tremors at first, minuscule shifts in the crust, the kind that were typically written off as background activity or tectonic restlessness. But they weren't random. Dar isolated a 6-hour window of seismic data from the same day Reyes's signal had reemerged. Within that span, he found 3 distinct pulses, spaced evenly at exactly 1-hour intervals, each followed by a faint change in the radio transmission's waveform. He expanded the window. The pattern persisted. The pulses were faint but consistent, like the earth was breathing in rhythm with the transmission, like a heartbeat. Dar leaned back, running a hand through his thinning hair. He cross-referenced the timing with the latest LIDAR elevation maps and ground-penetrating radar scans taken by the Park Service during their initial cave surveys. What emerged was a disturbing hypothesis. The cave system, Whisper Sync, wasn't just an isolated chamber. It was a conduit, a natural resonator. And something deep below it was producing ultra-low frequency waves, bouncing them off the walls and ceilings of the cave like sound in a cathedral. He scribbled equations on the whiteboard, trying to make sense of the resonance. Frequency, wavelength, decay rate. Everything pointed toward the existence of a subsurface structure. Something massive, with an acoustic profile unlike any natural formation he'd encountered. Not a magma chamber, not a void. Something denser, stranger. When the team reconvened on a conference call later that day, Dar laid it out as calmly as he could. The signal is not self-sustaining. It's being amplified. The cave is functioning as an antenna, a natural one, perhaps modified. The low-frequency pulses are feeding it energy, or carrying it. And the call sign, the Morse code, that's being piggybacked onto the signal. Like a carrier wave? Arden said. Exactly. It's possible Reyes encoded it before his death as a kind of identifier, or... Dar hesitated. The signal learned it, adopted it, repeated what it heard. Maya frowned. Are we talking about an artificial source? I don't know what we're talking about, Dar admitted. But it's not random. There's intent behind this. A silence settled over the line. It wasn't just a ghost transmission from a lost man in a cave. It was something older, deeper, pulsing from beneath the ground in perfect time. Something using the earth's bones to speak. And no one knew who or what it was trying to reach. The container was found wedged behind a wall of stacked stones in Reyes's final shelter, half buried beneath a flattened coil of paracord and a torn section of thermal blanket. It was small and military in design, a weatherproof, dented black box with a reinforced latch and no markings on the exterior. At first glance, looked like standard gear. maybe used to store electronics or matches. But when Arden opened it, careful not to disturb the brittle air inside the chamber, what she found was neither tool nor supply. Inside was a folded piece of waterproof stationery, sealed in a double layer of Ziploc and plastic wrap. It bore a name scrawled in black Sharpie across the top: Marisol, Reyes's sister. Arden removed the layers gently and handed the letter to Maya, who sat cross-legged on the stone floor with a headlamp angled down like a spotlight on the page. She unfolded the sheet carefully, its creases worn soft, the ink smudged at the edges by time and condensation. The writing was erratic, lines skewed upward and downward across the page, but the words were legible, clear even. Marisol. I don't know what day it is. Time doesn't work right down here. I sleep, but I don't dream. I wake, but the darkness doesn't change. I think I've been here weeks. It might be months. At first I thought I fell, injured my leg, lost my bearings, but it's not that. There's something in the rock, in the sound. I followed a vibration, like a frequency you can feel in your teeth. I thought it might lead to a vent or a passage up. It led somewhere else. Maya paused, breath catching slightly as she turned to the next paragraph. The lines grew shakier, like his hand had begun to tremble as he wrote. There's a chorus in the walls. Not voices exactly, not language, but layered sound, like dozens of people trying to hum the same note and never quite matching. Sometimes it's low, like a breath. Sometimes it spikes and I black out. The walls shimmer when it happens. I found this room. It was waiting. It's shaped too perfectly. Nothing natural about it. Like it was carved to fit something or someone. I started counting the days, but the tallies don't add up. I'd sleep and 5 more would appear, or fewer, or none. I don't remember making them all. Maya turned to the final line slowly. The ink was darker there, pressed harder into the paper. If someone finds this, turn around. Don't go past the hum. It knows when you do. It watches from behind the stone. It listens when you speak, and it remembers what you sound like. I think it's learning to answer. Tell Marisol I'm sorry. I didn't mean to stay, but I can't find the way back. And I think if I did, it wouldn't let me leave. Elliot beneath the signature was a shaky drawing, a circle with 3 concentric rings and a jagged crack splitting them all down the center. Arden stared at it in silence, then took the letter and sealed it back inside the box. No one spoke for a long time. Outside the shelter, somewhere deep in the cave's arterial dark, the hum seemed to rise for just a moment. And then, like breath being held, it stopped. They had planned to be out by nightfall. After recovering Reyes's remains and documenting the final chamber, the team packed their gear in grim silence. The air in Whisper's Sink had grown heavier, the oppressive atmosphere of the cave now charged with something electric, subtle but unmistakable. Every sound seemed sharper, more pronounced. The crunch of gravel underfoot, the hiss of breath in their headlamps, the faint tap of carabiners against rock. It was as if the cave was listening, holding its breath. Arden was the first to notice it. She'd been climbing back toward the mid-chamber when her portable radio, long thought to be dead weight in the signal-choked depths, chirped to life with a jagged burst of static. She froze mid-step, fumbling to bring the device up to her ear. The others gathered around quickly, their own radios flickering back to life in rapid succession. Then it came. The signal, clear, confident, and too strong to be local. Morse code. The same rhythm they all knew by heart now. KC4EYR, then silence. Not static. Silence. Full and deliberate. Micah blinked, mouth open slightly. "That's coming from outside," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "From everywhere?" The confirmation came seconds later, piped through the emergency frequency of the park's handheld communication system. A voice, flat, official, slightly shaken, cut through the cave's thick air. "Dispatch to field units, be advised. Multiple repeater towers across Districts 6, 7, and 9 are currently transmitting synchronized Morse code matching inactive call sign KC4EYR. Repeat, this is not a test. Sources unknown. Towers have not been manually triggered." Price swore under his breath. Dr. Fern took a step back from the rock wall, her eyes scanning the ceiling like the signal might crawl out of the stone itself. Maya grabbed her handset, trying to respond, but the line had already collapsed into noise again. Above ground, the effect was immediate and unsettling. Park volunteers stationed miles apart, at fire lookouts, ranger cabins, roadside trailheads, reported hearing the transmission simultaneously, their radios squawking to life in eerie unison. Cell towers picked it up too, echoing Rhea's long-dead call sign across frequencies it had no business occupying. And then came the pattern. Every 7 minutes, the signal would repeat. Morse. Silence. Then again. It didn't cycle endlessly. It pulsed, waited, and then returned. Like sonar, like echolocation, like a hand tapping in the dark, expecting an answer. Micah stared at the receiver in his hand, where the light blinked red, then green, then red again. "It's not just looping," he said quietly. "It's checking, listening for something." "Or someone," Arden added, her voice brittle. The repeaters had formed a perfect radius around Whisper's Sink, a 40-mile halo of blind broadcast. None of them had been activated manually. Each tower ran on isolated systems, some of them decades old, incapable of syncing without a central command. Dr. Dar, watching the same transmission light up across his spectral arrays back at the lab, murmured a single phrase as the analysis printed to screen. The cave spoke. And now something's answering. Whatever Reyes had awakened, whatever force had waited behind the hum, it had reached out beyond the stone, beyond the cave, and found a way to listen in return. The signal was no longer a memorial. It was an invitation. The official line was safety, structural instability, risk of further collapse. But everyone on the team knew it was fear, an institutional reflex to slam the door shut when something didn't fit the narrative. Whisper Sink was declared off-limits within 24 hours of the repeater event. Park Service barricades were erected. Monitoring equipment was installed at the mouth of the cave. No public statements were made. Reyes's name was mentioned only once in the internal memo, classified as recovered remains under extraordinary circumstances. Arden didn't argue. She nodded through the debriefings, handed over her field notes, and signed the non-disclosure forms. Then she went home, drew the blackout curtains, and started listening. She had captured 7 iterations of the repeater signal before the cave was sealed. Enough to run a full spectrographic analysis. Enough to chase what her gut had been screaming since the first echo in the dark. That the signal was not random, not merely broadcasting a call sign, it was pointing. The breakthrough came at 3:14 a.m., after nearly 40 hours of combing through timestamp data and filtering modulation patterns through a delay lattice algorithm she had once used to triangulate bat colonies. The pauses between transmissions weren't static. They fluctuated slightly, milliseconds apart, but not arbitrarily. She plotted them as intervals across a timeline and discovered a sequence of numbers embedded in the gaps. Latitudinal and longitudinal variants, 6 decimal places each, a coordinate. When she mapped it, her breath caught in her throat. The point didn't lie on the surface. It was subterranean, beneath the cave's mapped floor by more than 700 feet, far deeper than any passage they had surveyed, far deeper than what should have been possible in this section of the Appalachians. The terrain, by all known geologic standards, shouldn't support a chamber at that depth, yet the signal said otherwise. She called Micah. He didn't need convincing. By the end of the call, they were already making lists. Gear, provisions, a modified repeater system of their own. No team, no cameras, no permission. It would be just the two of them. Maya called the next morning. She had heard something, probably through informal channels, and asked Arden point-blank if she was planning to go back in. Arden lied, said number, said she was done, said she had made peace. Maya paused, then said, "If you do go back, don't expect it to be the same cave." It wasn't a warning. It was a kindness. 3 days later, under cover of a storm that swept through the ridgeline and drowned all park surveillance feeds in rain static and lightning noise, Arden and Micah slipped past the barricades and descended into Whisper Sink one final time. The rope system was more elaborate this time. Micah had fabricated a vertical harness for deep drop navigation, knowing they would likely have to carve their way through unmapped terrain. Arden carried the modified signal array, tuned not to broadcast, but to listen. The frequency had changed since the last cycle. It was subtle, like a note shifted half a pitch, but it was leading them, drawing them. As they dropped into the dark, headlamps flickering against ancient stone, neither of them spoke. There was no need. The hum was already there, vibrating just beneath the threshold of thought, wrapping itself around their bones. They weren't chasing echoes anymore. They were going to meet whatever waited at the end of the signal. Recovered document. Fragmented field report. Dated May 12th, 2024. Source: audio-embedded transceiver logs retrieved near Whisper Sink's secondary descent shaft. Author: Arden Blake. The first fragment begins with static, pulsing, irregular, like the cave itself is breathing through the equipment. Then, Arden's voice, distorted but recognizable, cuts through the noise. Descent time: 0437 hours. We've passed the geothermal vent chamber. No structural anomalies yet. Signal strength is rising the deeper we go. It's steady now, not looping. The next entry picks up 12 minutes later. Micah's voice is faint in the background, marking depth intervals. This shaft doesn't match anything in the previous survey. We're moving vertically now. Free fall space beyond what the radar mapped last year. The stone is too smooth, like it was cut, not formed. A pause. Then Arden again, her voice lower, almost whispering. There's no wildlife, no insects, no dripping water, nothing. Just the hum. It's louder down here. Feels like it's under my skin. Hours pass. The file skips. When the recording resumes, their breathing is heavier. The tone has changed. We found the source, Arden says. Not the transmitter. Something bigger, a chamber. A vault. The words resonant vault appear multiple times in the remaining logs, usually accompanied by phrases like geometrically impossible and non-reflective surfaces. The signal they had been tracking, Reyes's signal, was no longer broadcasting from a fixed point. It was coming from the walls themselves. At one point, Micah reports that the light from his headlamp is no longer behaving properly, casting no shadows, refracting in strange patterns. Arden confirms that their compasses have spun continuously since entering the vault. Neither mentions turning back. In one particularly garbled stretch of recording, Arden is speaking rapidly, her voice overlapping itself as though the radio is replaying fragments out of order. Can't tell if it's echo or memory. Repeats what we say, but in a different tone. Micah, did you hear that? It spoke your name. Then silence again. The final transmission is brief and hauntingly clear, recovered from the highest fidelity burst in the entire log. Arden's voice is calm, almost reverent. We were wrong. It's not just sending, it's listening. That was the last anyone heard from Arden Blake or Micah Dolan. Their bodies were never recovered. A year later, after an unusually shallow earthquake shook the region near Whisper Sink, a team of surveyors discovered a portable transceiver buried in a landslide near a side shaft previously unknown. The casing bore Arden's initials, and the last broadcast was still logged in the memory buffer. The cave has since been resealed by federal authorities. No official explanation has been released to the public. Unofficially, within certain corners of the academic and amateur radio communities, the signal still appears. Weak, sporadic, always the same. A low-frequency pulse followed by a voice, fragmented and genderless, whispering names that don't always match the missing. Some say it's trying to make contact. Others say it's remembering the ones who listened. But those who've heard it agree on one thing. It's still down there,